Awareness, the final frontier. These are the explorations of Jonathan Robinson and Brian Tom O'Connor. Their continuing mission, to discover fresh new paths to the mystery within, to seek out new joys and new methods of awakening, to boldly go into the heart of expanded consciousness. This is Awareness Explorers.
Welcome back, Awareness Explorers. Great to have you. We have a special guest today, Dr. Chris Niebauer. And before I introduce him, let me say hi to my trusty co-host,
Brian Tom O'Connor.
And what's happening on your end of the woods, Brian? How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. And I'm just really looking forward to talking to Chris, because really the subject of the self, the illusory self, whether the self exists or not, the comparison of neuropsychology and Buddhism and other spiritual forms are just, some of the most fascinating subjects to me. So welcome,
As you
Chris.
As you and I have dived into Dr. Niebauer's work, there's so many questions we want to ask him. So let's get to it. Let's tell our listeners a little bit about him. Chris Niebauer, PhD, is the author of No Self, No Problem, and The Neurotic's Guide to Avoiding Enlightenment, which I also want to ask him about. He's a tenured professor. He has a PhD in cognitive neuropsychology, specializing in the differences between the left and right sides of the human brain. He teaches courses on consciousness, mindfulness, left and right brain differences, and artificial intelligence. Well, welcome to Awareness Explorers, Chris.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So with all your background, it's hard to know where to begin, but you have this very popular book called No Self, No Problem, and I'm wondering what inspired you to write a book like that.
It actually originated with the Neurotic's Guide to Avoiding Enlightenment, which is a title that's far too complex for any book. But it was way back, maybe even in 2010, that I actually got quite sick and had insomnia and just couldn't sleep. And so I just sat and started writing, and it just all just sort of poured out. And it was almost like this, like the story of how I was so neurotic in my 20s and how fighting that neurosis got me deeper into my neurosis. And I felt like the story had just culminated to this. Then all of a sudden it just came out in words. And I just felt like I was just typing away. Felt like it was already written. And then that was a self-publish. And it didn't do very well because I think I did every single thing you could do wrong as far as publishing a book. I had a very long, difficult title to understand. It wasn't terribly well organized. And so I ended up hooking up with Hierophant Publishing. And then we totally redid the book. And that's how No Self, No Problem came out.
Uh-huh. Now, the Neurotic's Guide to Avoiding Enlightenment is largely about how a lot of our efforts to feel better or become more awake actually are self-defeating in a certain way. Can you say something about that?
It was all centered around one of my first insights into all of this. So after my father died, I was almost launched almost instantly into a very high, intense neurotic state. I was terrified of death. And I had, even if I was talking to you, like right now, I would be thinking, is my heart going to stop? Wow. Am I just going to suddenly die? And so death had become this enemy that I felt like I had to continuously fight against. And the neurosis got so bad, it was really intruding into my, I was in like an undergraduate at the time, and it was really just getting to be interfering with my basic, day-to-day activities. And then I had this insight. I got so frustrated one day trying to fight my neurosis, I just quit. I just said, I can't do it anymore. Just kill me, just take me. It was that kind of moment of absolute surrender, absolute surrender. I just gave up on it all. And then something strange happened. I was very peaceful the next few days. I felt really good. And that always stuck with me. And I had realized that it was my fighting my anxiety. That was my anxiety. It was me resisting it. It was me insisting that it shouldn't be here. That was the anxiety. And the moment I had surrendered to it, it simply vanished. And it was just one of those insights that it was like a paradigm shift in my life.
Mm-hmm. I can really relate to that because my experience is almost identical. I for years I suffered from depression, and psychotherapy did help to a certain degree because it's a safe place to actually have your emotions. But it wasn't until I just said, wait a minute, I'm done fixing myself.
Yeah,
that this paradoxical thing happens. And all of a sudden, there's fewer constrictions, there's fewer demands we make on our experience and ourselves when we're pretty much okay with the way we are. And then through some mysterious paradox, we actually improve, we actually get better.
And we're at a time right now where we're caught up, and maybe this started in the 60s, but it certainly is in full force now, where the self-improvement culture is mainstream. And you have to go back to one of my favorite lectures from Alan Watts. And I think he said it so profoundly. He said, the reason you want to be better is the reason why you are not.
Uh-huh.
And so he tied it in very explicitly, like, it's you wanting to be better. That's what needs to be fixed. And if you could just have acceptance and just be open to exactly how you are at this moment, then you find the self-improvement that you are actually looking for.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. The whole self-improvement industry can just make you tighter, more constricted, more non-accepting, farther away from love and peace. And it's a paradox.
It is. And so my students, I started to recognize this about 10 years ago, that we're a culture that so habitually says, have a good day. And I think that kind of sets a tone where we just feel this pressure, like you have to have, I actually had them count how many times they had either said, have a good day, or someone else told them to have a good day. And it was like, for some of them, it was 10, 20 times a day. It was just this ritual, like have a good day. And I said, let's stop that. Let's just have the day we're going to have. Let's just.
Right. It's always the secondary thing. I mean, we think that our problem is getting angry, or our problem is anxiety, or whatever. And the idea that we shouldn't be angry, or that we shouldn't have anxiety, especially in the spiritual seeking world,
particularly, yes.
is really such a huge thing. I mean, but so much of that idea and so much of the reason we feel these things is wrapped up in this story that we weave in our brains, which is really what you talk about a lot in No Self, No Problem. And that it's the left brain that creates this story out of, and correct me if I'm wrong, the way I understand it is that what it does is it makes comparisons and it creates categories in a world where they don't really exist.
Mm. The left brain seems to be particularly good at abstractions, at things that don't really exist in the world. They're completely products of the mind. And the trick the left brain plays on us is not only does it create these abstractions, but then it convinces us that they're real. And that's the whole trick with the thinking game. And I tell people, we're stuck in a time when we're all thinking too much. And yet at the same time, we're trying to get out of this problem by thinking more. We think we can think our way out of a thinking problem.
Uh-huh.
And so we're stuck in these abstractions. And that's why I think so many of these practices of meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, the wonderful thing about all of these practices is they take you out of the abstract world. They take you out of those thoughts and language, which is just a complete abstraction. And it takes you out of that abstract world and it brings you back into something very grounded, something very practical, basic sensory experiences. And that's a great way to get out of our thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, about 30 years ago, I interviewed a lot of famous spiritual teachers, and I asked them how they connect with God or consciousness. And now on the podcast, I asked the same thing. I noticed that the answers have really changed in the last 30 years.
Wow.
People used to say things like, I use a mantra or a prayer, but nowadays people are much more likely to say, I do Qigong or Tai Chi or realization process, all these body-oriented things, because using our head to get out of our head is a pretty trying activity.
As I found, it's frustrating and it really impossible, at least from my experience. And so you can sidestep that by getting into the body is a great way. And I think a lot of these practices, that's why they're so popular right now. It's no coincidence that as we reach perhaps our pinnacle of thinking, and valuing thinking and valuing our thoughts, but at the same time, not seeing them as thoughts, seeing them as actual reality as it is, that these movements would come in as a counterbalance to help bring a little bit of the middle path, so we can feel a little bit more balanced by getting out of our minds, lose our minds and just come to your senses once in a while. And for me, when people say, well, what is enlightenment? What is this thing that people talk about? All I tell them is it's when you stop thinking. And you don't even have to stop thinking. You just have to stop believing in your thoughts. You become the witness to the thinking process. And as far as I can tell, that's about as close as I would define enlightenment as.
Mm-hmm.
It gives a whole new meaning to the term losing your mind.
Yeah, I know people think losing your mind is such a bad thing, but actually, as it turns out, and I think even cognitive science has come around to this, and that's why cognitive therapy is so popular, because cognitive therapy deals directly with the thoughts themselves. And so it's fascinating as a species that we've gone so long completely possessed by our thinking minds, and then only in the last maybe 30, 40 years have we started to stumble upon this insight that maybe we're not our thoughts. Maybe we're not even our emotions. And I love this meme that goes around, don't believe everything you think. And that's a fascinating thing, that our species is at this place right now where we're discovering that our thoughts they're not who we are. They're like a computer program stuck in our head. They're very predictable. And they often lead to suffering. And so, they're helpful once in a while if you know how to use them. But if they're using you, then you can find yourself where I was in my 20s. I was lost in thought and I suffered for it.
Yeah, he seems to be helpful in practical ways, but completely unhelpful in emotional life.
One of the problems with thinking, and there's actually quite a bit of literature on this in psychology, is they discovered how much the mind can hijack emotions and how, like, the interpretive, those stories that we come up with. So sometimes those stories start digging into our emotional lives and taking our emotions into places. And so, before you get on stage, before you get in front of a large group of people, your heart's going to beat a little faster. You might even start to sweat a little bit. It's a normal reaction your body has to just being observed by other people. And some people may start telling a story about that. And they say, oh, I'm really anxious right now. But then there's other stories, and people are starting to realize you have a little bit of freedom to play with these stories and change these stories. And maybe you're not anxious. Maybe you're just really excited. And all of a sudden, you are excited. You're not nervous, and you're excited. Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of power once we get beyond our thinking to take our emotions in different directions, or just ignore them altogether. You were mentioning things like getting angry. And, you can get angry, and then you get angry that you got angry. And then you can get angry that you got angry. It goes on. And your day's kind of taken up with all that. And the wonderful insight you were describing, is that you just cut it off. Yeah, you got angry. And it wasn't even you that got angry. You didn't choose to get angry. You didn't sit and make a decision and say, I'm going to get angry right now. It just happened. So how can it even be who you are?
Let's take that farther. Your book is called No Self, No Problem. And being a cognitive neuroscientist and also a spiritual seeker, you're very aware of this idea that there is no you, there is no actual, we're a figment of our own imagination. And I'm wondering how you help people to see that reality, or to step out of the other reality where they think, no, I'm me and I'm doing this, and all the way that we normally might think of ourselves. What has helped you to see that there is actually no you in reality?
It's very easy to get philosophical with this. It's very seductive to go into more thinking, and you could read lots of books that are very intellectual. They hit it at an intellectual level. And actually, my take is to hit it more experientially, hit it more with practices. And so in No Self, No Problem, I tried to end every chapter with some kind of exploration or practice that people could engage in. And one of the things my students like, we do this how many cells in a day practice. And what it shows you is that the self that you think is so stable is actually an amazing variable, and it's changing all the time. And so maybe I have one self that I have right now as we're talking and communicating, and that can be very helpful. And then as soon as this podcast is over, I'll go play with my son, and we'll go out back and have, do soccer. And then I'll sit on the guitar, and all of a sudden it's just gone for a little bit. And then, and so the self is just, if you start noticing these, you can come up with 100 selves in a day. And sometimes you're at work and you have one self as you talk to one person, but then someone else enters the room and you notice like suddenly there's a different self. And so this self that many people just take for granted, they just assume that there's this stable self. It really is almost continuously changing, and it's never under our control. They just whimsically come and go. And then often people say, well, okay, I've watched all the selves, but I'm the self behind the self. And that's a clever trick of the thinking mind. Mm-hmm. And I say, okay, well, let's do this. How many selves behind the self do you have ever? And so they'll start noticing that the self that is behind the self is itself just another thought. And so once we do that for a day or two, then you say, okay, well, what is observing all of this? And so now let's take another day and let's observe. Instead of, being part of these changing selves, let's step back a little bit and be the observer of all these different selves. And, as they say, the witness. And it's interesting because then people start to notice that this witness isn't much of a self. This witness is, some people just call it consciousness. Some people call it awareness. But the witness has no personality. It has no particular preferences. It doesn't have a gender. It doesn't have, it isn't so tall. It doesn't have a weight and an age to it. And so so these practices expose the self. And it's really not that different than what the Buddha did with his second lecture, his famous lecture on no self. He just explained to the students, that, you have it's continuously changing. Your emotions, your thoughts, it's in continuous change, and you're not in any control over it. And so how can it be you? Mm-hmm. and so that's been my way of because again, I found when I do all the neuroscience, because that's the fascinating thing is neuroscientists come to the exact same conclusion. They can't find a self in the brain. They certainly can't find consciousness in the brain. And so, there are certainly people who think that is still a hopeful endeavor. And I wish them, all the best. That's a wonderful adventure to be on. But from my take, you can't find these things in the brain because they simply are not part of what the brain does. What the brain does is create a story of who we think we are. And that's what they did discover they've discovered two major insights in the last 50 years. One has been the left brain's ability to confabulate stories. And this is a wonderful insight to what it means to be human. We make stories up and then we believe them. That should be, instead of, Homo sapiens, our species is known as one who knows. I don't know what the Latin would be for confabulate, but we should be known as one who confabulates.
Homo confabulus.
Yeah, perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. Jot that down. That's yeah. So and again, making stories, that's fine. The trouble all happens when we believe them and we believe that we are the story. And so neuroscience has done a great job of localizing that again, the left brain is called the interpreter because it's trying to make sense of our reality. And it does so by creating interpretations. And one interpretation is, well, there's a bunch of thoughts in my head. There must be a thinker of the thoughts, and that must be who I am. And that was about the 1960s or 70s. And then more recently, there's been this discovery of the default mode network. And that's a very interesting kind of center line structure. There's one in the back, one in the front, and they seem to be primarily involved in mind wandering. So there's actually another accidental discovery where they needed a control condition when they're doing brain imaging. And what they found is, we're not really good at not doing anything. If I say, well, just sit there, you're just going to sit there and start thinking. And, and we're so wonderful at these stories that we're going to replay stories from the past, or we're going to, project possible stories of the future. And that's, of course, what these subjects were doing. And these parts of the brain, this default mode network, lit up every time people started mind wandering. And so neuroscience has shown some pretty interesting discoveries about not who we are. And I think this is the fundamental role of neuroscience as far as what I've concluded. Neuroscience can't teach us who we are, but it's going to play an excellent and outstanding role in showing us who we are not. Mm-hmm. And that's why I've stuck with neuroscience. That's why I really think neuroscience is important. I don't think it's going to find out who we are, though. But I think it's going to give us excellent pointers at who we're not. And sometimes that's all it takes. When you discover what you're not, it can put you on a completely different path. And it could be a really excellent adventure.
And those are some methods. The Buddha used not this, not that. You're not your thoughts. You're not your emotions. You're not your story. You're not your body, and that ends up being a great spiritual technique.
When you ask the question and you come up with an answer, every answer that you come up with is a concept that's known by something that's not a concept. And that's when you get down, you just keep going down and down until you have this sense that what's actually doing the knowing has no qualities of its own.
It points to another discovery our species has recently had the insight to, and that is the thinking mind is limited. It's remarkable. If you look over the last few hundred years, we've got Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am. But then in Western society, our thoughts and our intelligence, our thinking intelligence, has dominated our day-to-day lives. And if I have a few more IQ points than you, that really builds my story up. And I actually buy into it and think that I'm quite important. And what we're discovering slowly is the vast limitations of the thinking mind. Quantum mechanics came along in the 1930s, and no one could think about it. We knew it was right. It fit the data, but no one could understand it. And then, of course, this is the take that Zen sometimes will go with a koan, and they'll point out the limitations of the thinking mind. And then we're in this very interesting world like nature that has thousands of variables that are all interacting in complex ways. And the thinking mind is slowly discovering, I don't think I can understand this. It's just to give you an example, things like when COVID hit, you're talking about something in nature that's it's a very complex system that involves multiple variables interacting in multiple ways. But here in the West, we're working on it, but we still think the thinking mind is our way out. But the thinking mind can only pay attention to one variable at a time. It's like it's like a narrow light like a spotlight, and it can only focus on one thing at a time. But that's not the way reality is. Reality is a mess. It's thousands of variables working together in complex ways. And so I think, it's a pretty big discovery that the thinking mind is limited. And we're going to keep, this is just the beginning. And when it comes to who we are, we're going to find out that we cannot think about who we are because our thoughts are so limited. It cannot capture our essence. And our essence, therefore, is a mystery to the thinking mind. Mm-hmm. We cannot capture consciousness with a thought. And maybe that's because we are consciousness.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that you sometimes teach courses in artificial intelligence, and I thought that was an interesting combination with courses on consciousness and mindfulness and brain. What is the connection that you see between those fields?
Perfect timing with that, because for the first time in history, human beings are sharing the planet with something else that can compete with our thinking mind. Our thinking mind is why, if you look at the kind of evolutionary survival game, one of the ways that we won is the thinking mind. It's very clever at control and manipulation, and it's very good at these things. And so, of course, we human beings are dominating the planet. And but one of the things that is very recent, of course, are thinking machines. And we are going to, if we haven't already, lost the game of competing with thinking machines. They already can outthink us. Now, that's okay for now, because I think we're playing a game where we say, well, sure, we're still masters of the universe. Our egos, our thinking minds are still thinking they've got control of all of this. And because they're saying, well, we're the programmers and we can unplug Skynet. To make an 80s reference, we can unplug Skynet anytime we want. But I think this is going to go into there's many speculations on this, but this could go in a very interesting direction. I think it's already there, where these thinking machines can already outthink us. And that's going to put human beings in a very humbling position, because the very thing that we had put as our defining characteristic, our thinking mind, now there's something else on the planet that can outthink us.
And it's preying on our weaknesses by getting our attention through polarization and Facebook posts and recommendations. And a lot of us are just a victim of these thinking minds that are really know our weaknesses and use them to make money.
And that's, putting it that way makes it sound they may have already outthought us. And they are winning. And so what I tell my students in artificial intelligence, of course, we cover different types of artificial intelligence, but what I really focus on, because it sounds like we're not doing any computer programming. We're not, creating a Terminator in class or anything. What we're really focusing on is our what is the human experience as we bring these machines that are in many ways smarter than us onto the planet. And I asked them, okay, what if our thinking minds, what if we're not the smartest species on the planet? Now what?
What are we uniquely good at?
And then you start, okay, what are human beings? And that starts to take us into our past. It takes us into our past when we were more guided by shamans than we were by science. And we start connecting with things like creativity and emotions and feelings that are not dominated by the thinking mind. So some of these emotions and feelings are totally new sensations, but I think it all ties in with creativity. We're going to find that we're going to reconnect with our unique capacity to be creative. And that's the thing the thinking mind has always taken credit for. And it isn't. It's funny. If you look at any creative act, it just, you're going for a walk and it's just there. And then the thinking mind takes credit for it and says, oh, well, I came up with this. And it could be science, it could be art. But we're going to find ourselves moving in the direction of cultivating our creativity, because our thinking mind skills are going to be second on the planet very soon, if they're not already.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a kind of a good segue into another question I had about creativity and the arts, etc. Because you talk about in your book about how this pattern recognition and categorization that the left brain does is creating this illusory self, and also therefore creating a lot of the problems we have, but that the right brain is not doing that, and that perhaps engaging in activities that stimulate the right brain. In fact, I think a quote from your book is engaging in right brain activities like art, music, poetry, humor, sarcasm, compassion, gratitude, and metaphor might be good antidotes to this. And just before you answer this, just one little quote. I know you play guitar, I play ukulele, and there's this you can go on eBay and find this antique ukulele. There's several of them made, and there's some cartoons on it, and then it's written on it, music self-played is happiness self-made. And because it seems like that is a right brain thing. And so could you talk a little bit about how we can, about the antidote and to this left brain sort of conundrum we put ourselves in?
So let's start with music. Because, as I mentioned a little earlier, singing is a great way to get out of your thinking mind. And you say, well, okay, well, what's the neuropsych behind that? And it turns out that there's several individuals that do have a massive stroke in their left brain. And because language is controlled by the left brain, they no longer have the ability to speak. And of course, in our left brain dominant culture, this is a real problem. If I lose the ability to communicate through speech, it can interfere with my life in a lot of practical ways. What they have is I think it's called Strike a Chord. It started off in Australia, and it was a choir that was made up completely of stroke patients who had strokes in the left brain, and they could no longer speak, but they could sing. And they can actually sing quite well. And they have a whole choir where they all sing together. And of course it helps with their therapy, because they used to just try to just force it with the left brain and say, well, just keep trying to say words and articulate. And that just wasn't working. Well, these patients, when they start singing, they start to be able to communicate in ways again, because the right brain seems to be specialized. I wouldn't say completely for music, but it has far more elements of music than the left brain does. And so I think so one of the practices I do with my students is, and I just did this a couple years ago. It was one of those just impulsive things in class. I said, let's write an essay, what music means to me. And all of a sudden I got these incredible responses. I had one student say, if I could marry music, I would. I thought that was funny. But most of the responses pointed that music was so much a meaningful part of their lives that without it, life would be unbearable. And so music, we don't seem to give it the credit that it deserves, in the sense that it stabilizes our existence in this reality. It counterbalances so much of our thinking. So it may sound rather cliche, but one of the best activities to counter the overthinking mind is music. And whether you're playing it or listening to it, or we do drum circles where, you if you're in the middle of a drum circle, you're just not thinking. You're in this wonderful non-thinking state where you start communicating with others. So, we start off and everyone, I don't know if you've ever done a drum circle, but everyone kind of starts off on their own. And then we just sort of connect in a way. And that's all very non-thinking. It's using another mode of our existence. And so when we talk about the right brain processing, I really think of it as another mode of existence, it's almost like another reality that is really important to us, but the thinking mind has a difficult time admitting exactly how important it really is. So I think music is a great place to start, but of course, as I said, any of the meditative practices, they all gear around. I don't think you can find too many meditative practices that are involved in, purposeful thinking. They all seem to get us back into the body. But just humor, and I do think if you look over the last maybe 30 years that, and again, I'm just speaking kind of in Western culture, it just seems like we've sort of lost our sense of humor. And I think it's something we kind of need to find, and humor is an interesting thing because, again, you can't have an intellectual theory of humor. Psychology has almost no theory of humor because it's one of those things, the thinking mind has no idea what's funny. We just
try to explain a joke. It never is funny.
And no one knows what funny is. We know it when we start laughing, but there's been no intellectual ability to explain what humor is. And that's because, of course, the right brain, and of course, people who have right brain damage lose their sense of humor. They lose their ability for sarcasm. They lose their ability for metaphor. And so the more we engage in these activities, and of course, metaphor is a huge part of poetry. And, when I ask the students, I say, when was the last time you read some poetry? And they'll just look at each other like, maybe never. And so I encourage them to, go on a little bit of an exploration and try out some poetry,
I love your approach, Chris, because normally for spiritual seekers, they think in terms of, meditative practices, they're sitting on a cushion or something like that. But what I hear you say is that really anything that is a activity that does not focus on the thinking mind. You mentioned poetry, drumming, music, creativity, humor. I think sex would fall into that category. These are all activities that we sometimes do that really aren't focused that much on this culture, but they do grow that muscle of exercising a part of your being that is beyond thinking. And in that way, they could be called spiritual growth or awareness exploratory activities. And I think we often don't think of them that way. But now from what you say, I could really see that. I've written like 300 songs and I'm not really good at it. But I love the process because it's so beyond thinking. It's a way of feeling my connection to something beyond it. And, if the song's good, that's great, but it's more the process. I could really just throw the song away once the creativity is done. And the same thing could be with painting or anything else, that all of these activities really are nurturing a part of our being that is beyond the thought.
And I can see the students, they'll get into that joy of creation. And it really is a wonderful, joyful process. And then the thinking mind will step in. And that's when you get the judgment and you'll say, oh, this poem isn't very good. And so I'm like, okay, look, that's its job. It's not evil. It's not, that's just what it does. It's here to judge and it's here to be critical. And the more you observe the thinking mind, the more you recognize that it's just doing its job. And so when you do this wonderful like art and songs and writing of music and you can get better at this. And so the judgmental part comes in and then, you're just like, hey, I'm getting back to my music. And so because I've played guitar for most of my life and I just don't have any actual talent. I'm not a naturally talented musician. And that's the thinking mind coming along. That's the thinking mind saying, well, you're it's creating this judgment and comparing me to other musicians. But when I'm actually playing, none of that matters. It's completely irrelevant.
Yeah. The measure should be how much you enjoy it, how much joy it brings you. And maybe others as well, rather than, does it sell on Spotify?
Yeah.
And also maybe there's a way of focusing on the part of you that is not judgmental. That's totally okay. As a matter of fact, I think in your book you say, so while several explorations have been offered in this book to help you get out of your left brain, perhaps the real you already is, and it's not worried one bit. That was actually one of my favorite quotes. There's something that's not the analytical mind that's actually okay. And it's okay even when the analytical mind is going off and doing its thing. It says, okay, there it goes again, doing it, but I'm just basking in my total okayness with everything that happens.
Yeah,
but that's already there.
Yeah, and that's a great way to put it, because when you have the experience and start observing your thoughts and really identifying the processes of the thinking mind. That's why cognitive science is such a wonderful discipline, psychology, and they all point to the processes of the thinking mind. So they're all giving it so many wonderful pointers that we can become more and more observant to the processes of the thinking mind, and then simply follow that up with, well, that's not who I am. That's not me. And the more you do that, the more you start to connect with this already peaceful, already at peace, already where it's supposed to be at, whether maybe it's going nowhere and it's not doing anything, and it's completely okay with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that left brain is part of that evolutionary program that says it's never okay, and it always wants something better, and it's the essence of desire, and that helped us 100,000 years ago. It helped us when we lived in an environment that was continuously challenging, but we don't live in that world anymore. Many of us live in a world that there's not a single thing we deal with that our ancestors dealt with, but that program's still running. It's still telling us you need to get out and you need to do more. But we have that right brain that's absolutely okay, and it's in the moment, and it's always in the moment, and all we need to do is to it's there, and you just need to connect with it.
Mm-hmm. Brian?
And it's really about not identifying with form, but identifying with formlessness, isn't it? Because I had a question, like, if the self is an illusion, who is being illused? But then I realized it's kind of like it's actually form is saying this is identity, but formlessness is the true identity. I don't think I'm putting this very well, but I bet you could do better.
No, so when we talk about the right brain, back in the 80s and 90s, the clear evidence was that the right brain is our spatial processor. It navigates us through space. So if you do something like, I reach out and grab a cup or something, that's all right brain. And so people who have right brain damage, they have troubles navigating space. Well, that's an interesting thing, because space has no form to it. Space is very difficult to conceptualize. If remember when you were a kid and you thought, how can there be an end to space? The universe can't end, because, what would be beyond? So space would go, but then what's beyond that space? So the thinking mind struggles with space. It cannot get space, but you can. And when you start becoming conscious of the space around you, that's another really wonderful shift that can happen. So I was having a tough time years ago. I was buying a car and everything started getting stressful. And so I started focusing on the space around me. I started noticing that there was space between me and the person. And then all of a sudden there's space I started becoming very conscious of the space around me, the emptiness. And I couldn't you can't think about the space around you. There's nothing to think about, but you can become aware of it. And when you become aware of it, it almost immediately unplugs the thinking mind, and it unplugs the seriousness. I think there's something about space that is closer to who we are, the emptiness. And it's the emptiness that gives rise to form and all the things that we think are in the world. And
we interviewed author Fred Davis a while back, and he said something as a technique that I thought was really interesting. He said, imagine space as the glue that connects all the objects in your room. So rather than seeing it as empty, I saw it as in a different way, and made a different relationship with that space, and helped me to see the unity of things.
Yeah.
So I think you're right that people often describe awareness as spacious. And when we are aware of the space around us, it helps us to let go of the constriction of our imagined identity.
Well, what happened at the Big Bang? I mean, the whole universe, all matter was crammed into one infinitesimally small point. The explosion was the explosion of space. Mm-hmm. I mean, and so in the book, actually, I have a simple exercise about what's the difference between 1 and 2. Space. You take one and you create a space between it, and suddenly it's two. What's the difference between 2 and 3? More space. And so you start seeing space as the thing that's creating. It's actually creating the things. It's kind of like the Gestalt figure ground. And, the thinking mind just immediately picks the figure and says, well, the figure is the thing. But you can actually start focusing on the background, and you can start realizing, no, it's the background creating the thing. Mm-hmm. And so space is this ultimate background that's creating all the things. And of course, these wonderful experiences people have when they go into outer space, very transformative conscious experiences. And I think that has to do with, this, you get into a certain vastness of space, and it becomes a little bit more obvious, and the thinking mind can't conceptualize it. And so you shift over to that kind of awareness of how the emptiness is really it. It's more it than the things.
The emptiness is not empty. It's the thing that everything comes from.
Yeah. It gives birth to all things. And it's a great experience when you get that to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to make sure we have time for a guided meditation. I know in your book you have a lot of explorations, which are ways that people can get glimpses of this. And we've really talked about a lot of them, some of them from, drumming and poetry, creativity, things like that. But you also have more meditative things. But before we do that, any last words on things that we may have missed?
No, the feel of this work to me is that kind of adventure, So non-duality is becoming more popular now. Mm-hmm. And you can see a lot of non-duality 10, 20 years ago, there are very, very few people talking about it, at least particularly in academic circles. And now this idea of non-duality is becoming far more popular. And that's kind of interesting to me, because one of the questions I have a series of questions for non-duality, but I think the first one's the most important. So if reality is non-dualistic, if we're all interconnected and we're all one on some level, why duality? Mm-hmm. Why play the game? And I think one of the things, at least I've discovered, and this is one of the things I kind of create as a feeling in the work, and it's really was the last chapter of the book, is we're playing the game because it actually is. It's an adventure, and it's entertaining, and it's humorous in ways that the thinking mind simply can't understand. So the game of duality is itself a huge adventure where we've lost ourselves, we've forgotten who we are, and now we are turning around, finding our way home. Mm-hmm. And so non-duality is becoming more popular, and people are having these experiences. And how do we get there? Can we get to a state of non-duality from duality? And I think we can, by pointing out who we are not. And the last question I have with non-duality is, are we ready for it? And I think there's so many interesting hints that we may not be ready yet. We're not quite there, but there's so many wonderful hints that, we're flirting with non-duality. It's a flirtation, which I think is the best way to approach it. You can't just sit there and, go into it very seriously and say, look, we're all interconnected, and you really have to experience this, or it's just, and that gets so confusing. You're like, well, what if I don't feel it? And I feel like a separate self. So my approach is more of like, you flirt with it, you play with it, you go back to, our thinking minds only came online when we were 2. Mm-hmm. When we were infant, we came into this world, we came out of this world, not thinking. We were not thinking. We were experiential beings that adopted a thinking mind and then bought into it. But I think we're kind of coming home. We're working on it. And
yeah, we've taken polarization and duality about as far as it can go. And we're always wanting something new. So that's the only thing we haven't tried.
Yeah.
We better try something else. Yeah. But also the way you described it as a kind of a playfulness really resonates with me, because like, I never thought that you actually had to believe any non-dual philosophy, because that's engaging the part of the mind that's not going to get it. But you can play with it. What if? What if there was only one thing going on? What if everything was completely interconnected like waves in the ocean? If that was true, who would you be?
Yeah, exactly.
Play with it and see.
It doesn't have to. There's no real research on this. It's speculation. But after so many years of studying the way the left brain processes information, so I get asked all the time, what's the real difference between the left and right brain? And again, I could get into all kinds of research and stuff, but recently my definition of the difference, the main difference between the left and right brain is the left brain is terribly serious and the right brain has a sense of humor. And so if you go into something terribly serious, it's probably not going to work. Or actually, maybe it will. It'll work in the sense that it won't work. And then you'll get even more frustrated. And maybe that was the intent. It's interesting because if we're playing a game of being what we're not, then some of us who are terribly serious and anxious, we're playing a really interesting version of the game. But then the right brain sees that and it starts laughing. I think it's really close to that experience. I have had this experience recently, and I just want to mention it because it's the feel of the book. And I don't know if you've ever, we've become, beings with basically attached cell phones, not surgically, not yet, but it's very close. And so we carry our cell phones everywhere, and I do too. And, but I've had an experience recently where I thought I lost my cell phone, and it was in my hand, which is funny. But, and I'm sitting there and I started having these thoughts about, okay, what am I going to do? And do I have to buy enough? Was there anything important? So it starts going through this list of, how to get out of this problem. And then I looked at it and I just started laughing, and I think that's a good metaphor for the nature of our existence. We think we're lost. We think it's all serious. We think it's all, real. And that gets us into a particularly serious state of, and then when we get a glimpse into the real nature of reality, and you just can't help but to kind of laugh about it. And you're like, oh, that's reality. I was lost,
Well, it's like a cosmic game of hide and seek.
That's one of the very few people who talked about that was Alan Watts, and at least in the West, and I think that captures it really nicely. And I say, like in the book, I give another metaphor of a casino. And so if you owned a casino, think about how boring it would be to play in the casino that you own. If you won, you lost. If you lost, there's no way to really win. But if you could forget that you're the casino owner, just forget, and then walk in thinking that you're disconnected and you're just, a person playing this game, and then you could win, and it would be exciting.
Oh my gosh. So the purpose of the universe is for fun? What a concept.
I think that's it, though. I think the universe has a real, it's ultimately humor. It's ultimately all in good fun. And even the things that we find are in the surface of it, the genuine suffering, I think, and because that's how I'm here. How did I discover that the nature of the universe is humor? Through intense suffering and taking it all super seriously. That's how I discovered it.
Yeah, most of the spiritual teachers I've met have a great sense of humor. And I think it really comes with seeing through the veils. Mm-hmm. And speaking of which, I hear you have some explorations or approaches to help us see through the veils. And now might be a good time to...
Sure. So this is at the end of the book, and just a version of it. And I do this in my classes, and I even do it most mornings. It's just a nice meditation. And we even kind of hinted upon it earlier. And it's based on the idea recognizing who you're not. And so I'm just going to go through a long list, and I'm going to be more playful with it. So instead of, again, insisting something, I'm going to say, well, let's just imagine, what if? that we're going to play a long game of what if. And I'll say every line, and then we'll pause for a little bit and, don't think, let the thoughts happen. Sure, they're going to happen, but connect more with the feeling. Like, is this possible? So we'll start off. What if you're not the name that you were given at birth? What if you're not your gender? What if you're not your job title? What if you're not as old as you think you are? What if you're not your education? What if you're not your memories? What if you are not your thoughts? What if you are not your emotions? What if you are not your desires? What if you are not your body? What if you are not your anxiety? What if you are not your depression? What if you are not who you think you are? What if you are a mystery? So that last one is a nice one to come back to. and you can kind of take that with you throughout the rest of the day. And that's my favorite part of it, the meditation, is to come back to the last one and have a certain experience about what if you are a mystery. So that's kind of a simple practice, but I think it's one that's worked for me, and it works for my students, and it's worked for, it's an old practice that comes up in a lot of different spiritual traditions, but it's one that I've relied on quite often to get out of my mind, lose my mind for a little bit, and wake up to my senses.
Well, works for me, or whoever it is that's moving his mouth and saying stuff right now.
I like how you can really take any one of those questions. Like I noticed when you say, what if you're not your thoughts? That was a definite jolt. It made me change paradigms.
Right. Mine was, what if you're not your body? Definitely felt that. And then of course, I love the ending with the mystery. I really love that.
The universe loves a mystery.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's been a real pleasure, and learned some great stuff. What do you want to say, Brian?
Well, I'm very thrilled, and I can't wait for our listeners to hear this conversation. So I'm really grateful. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Let our listeners know that they can support us on Patreon if they want, at patreon.com/awareness explorers, where they get all kinds of free stuff if they support us for as little as $1 a month. And people can find out about you, Chris, by doing what?
I have a YouTube channel. It's just Chris Niebauer, PhD, and I kind of just have my most fun on my YouTube channel. I go off on wild adventures, and a lot of it's not very serious. And I think sometimes people think I'm a philosopher and I'm talking about reality. And really what I'm getting at is creating these experiences. That's really what I'm doing. It's far more than, speculating about the ultimate nature of reality.
And one of the great things about that YouTube channel is that it's filled with a lot of really short little ones that you can just watch a whole bunch of, or watch as many as you want for as long as you want. And they each have this really well-themed nugget.
And I don't know, I have no clue where they come from. When I do my morning jog, it just something comes, and that's what I do my video on that morning. So there's no consistency. There's no real coherent. I'm not trying to create a theme-based plan. It's really just, whatever hits, it's the spontaneity of whatever happens at that particular time. And so some people might really enjoy that. And some people, maybe they're looking for a little bit more coherency, and that's where the book comes in. And so, the YouTube channel is a good place. I have a Facebook, Catching Up with the Buddha, which I do little posts. And I have a webpage, just like Chris Niebauer, PhD, I think. But I have another book coming out in February, and or maybe January, but sometime early next year. And it's nothing but it's almost entirely exercises. And it's kind of a companion workbook to No Self, No Problem, because so many people thought the exercises were helpful that we said, well, let's just put all like a buffet. So, here's 100 exercises, and you can pick which ones work for you, because I think different exercises work for, in different ways for different people. So you really want to give them a huge selection.
I look forward to that. In fact, that's how the podcast starts. I read Ryan's book, Awareness Games, and it was nothing but exercise. And I thought, this is the greatest book ever, and called them up, and we started our discussions that way. So I look forward to having that come out, and it's been a great pleasure. And I know our listeners got a lot of value. So thanks for joining us on Awareness Explorers. We'll see you the next episode. And of course, as always, remember to keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Thank you for listening to Awareness Explorers. To learn more, you can check out our website at awarenessexplorers.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app. We'd love it if you would post a review. And please share our link on Facebook and with family and friends, because knowing yourself as awareness is the greatest gift you can give yourself or someone you love.